A glimmer of hope. Sri Lanka's economy is finally showing signs of life after a brutal economic crisis. Remember 2022? Yeah, those were dark times. People were struggling to afford basic necessities. The country was in turmoil. But now, things are looking up. The economy is actually growing again. Can you believe it? Real GDP growth hit 5% in 2024. That's huge. That's the highest it's been in 7 years. The central bank had predicted a measly 3% growth, but Sri Lanka blew past that. It's like that underdog story everyone loves. This growth is being fueled by a surge in the first 9 months of 2024. Inflation has also cooled down significantly. It actually dipped into negative territory in December 2024. Don't worry, it's not as bad as it sounds. It's expected to bounce back soon. The central bank is aiming for a steady 5% inflation rate. Sri Lanka is on the mend, but there's still a long way to go. It's like recovering from a really bad cold. You're not quite back to your old self yet, but at least you can breathe again. The people have spoken. Sri Lanka has a brand new president. Out with the old, in with the new. Anura Kumara Dissanayake of the National People's Power, NPP, alliance, won the election in September 2024. He kicked out the previous president, Ranil Wickremesinghe. Talk about a political shakeup. But that's not all. The NPP went on to win a massive majority in the parliamentary elections in November 2024. They basically cleaned house. It was a landslide victory. The people were clearly ready for a change. This new government has a lot on its plate. They inherited a country still reeling from an economic crisis, but they also have a mandate for change. The people have spoken. They want a government that's going to fight for them, not for the elite. Only time will tell if Dissanayake and the NPP can deliver on their promises. But one thing's for sure, Sri Lankan politics just got a whole lot more interesting. Sri Lanka needed help, and they got it from the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Think of the IMF as a financial life raft. They swooped in with a $2.9 billion loan program back in March 2023. That was just the beginning. They also helped Sri Lanka restructure a whopping $25 billion in debt. That's a lot of zeros. Basically, they hit the reset button on Sri Lanka's debt, but there's a catch. The IMF doesn't just hand out money for free. They want to see some changes. They're like that friend who lends you money, but only if you promise to get your finances in order. The IMF has some conditions for Sri Lanka. They want the government to implement some serious reforms. These include tackling corruption, increasing revenue, and getting spending under control. It's like a financial boot camp, but for an entire country. These reforms are crucial for Sri Lanka's recovery, but they're not without their critics. Some people argue that these measures will disproportionately impact the poor. It's a delicate balancing act. Scars of the past. Sri Lanka's history is marred by a long and brutal civil war. The conflict ended in 2009, but the scars remain. We're talking about serious human rights violations, folks. Things like extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, and torture. It's heavy stuff. The new government came into power promising justice and reconciliation. They vowed to address these past atrocities, but so far, they haven't made much progress. It's like they're stuck in neutral. The UN Human Rights Council is keeping a close eye on Sri Lanka. They've been critical of the government's lack of action. They're calling for international investigations into these conflict-era abuses. Accountability is key, people. Civil society organizations are also facing restrictions, especially in Tamil-majority areas. It's like the government is trying to silence any dissent. This is not a good look, Sri Lanka. You can't just sweep these issues under the rug. Section 5, the weight of debt. Can Sri Lanka achieve sustainable growth? Okay, so the economy is showing signs of life, but there's a big fat elephant in the room, and that elephant is debt. Sri Lanka is drowning in it. Remember that IMF bailout and debt restructuring? Yeah, that was just the first step. The central bank knows this. They've been very vocal about the need for transformative growth. They're not talking about your average run-of-the-mill growth. They're talking about growth that fundamentally changes the game. Growth that allows Sri Lanka to finally get a handle on its debt. This is not going to be easy. It requires a complete overhaul of the economy. Sri Lanka needs to attract foreign investment. It needs to diversify its industries. It needs to create more jobs. Think of it as a complete economic makeover. It's a daunting task, but it's not impossible. Sri Lanka has the potential to turn things around, but it's going to take time, effort, and a lot of hard work. Section 6, the human cost of crisis, poverty, inequality, and social unrest. The economic crisis hit Sri Lanka hard, Like, really hard. It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it's about real people's lives. The poverty rate doubled during the crisis. Can you imagine that? Twice as many people struggling to survive. The United Nations reported an increase in child stunting. That's a clear sign that children aren't getting the nutrition they need. People are having a hard time affording basic necessities like food and medicine. It's a dire situation. The economic crisis has also exacerbated existing inequalities. The gap between the rich and the poor is widening. The middle class is shrinking. It's a recipe for social unrest. The government needs to address these issues head-on. They need to implement social safety nets to protect the most vulnerable. They need to create jobs and opportunities for all Sri Lankans. It's about creating a fairer and more just society. Section 7. Walking a tightrope, balancing reforms with public well-being. The IMF reforms are like a double-edged sword. On one hand, they're necessary to get Sri Lanka's economy back on track, but on the other hand, they can be painful, especially for the poor and middle class. It's a delicate balancing act. The previous government tried to implement similar reforms under a previous IMF program. They cut subsidies and increased taxes, but they didn't do it in a way that protected the poor. In fact, it ended up hurting them the most. The new government needs to learn from these mistakes. They need to find a way to implement these reforms without causing undue hardship on the most vulnerable. It's about finding that sweet spot between economic growth and social justice. It's a tough task, but it's not impossible. It requires careful planning, consultation, and a commitment to protecting the most vulnerable. Section 8. Justice delayed, justice denied. The fight for accountability continues. The new government promised to address past human rights violations. They said they would repeal the Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act. This law has been used to silence dissent and target minorities for years. But guess what? They haven't repealed it. In fact, they're still using it. It's like they're saying one thing and doing another. Not cool, Sri Lanka. Not cool. And it gets worse. The government has been accused of appropriating land and religious sites belonging to Tamil and Muslim communities. This is causing tensions and resentment. It's like they're deliberately trying to provoke people. The international community is watching. They're urging the Sri Lankan government to take concrete steps towards accountability and reconciliation. They need to address these issues head-on, or risk further instability. Section 9. Looking ahead. A future of promise or peril for Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is at a crossroads. The country is showing signs of recovery, but challenges remain. It's like they're standing at the foot of a mountain. They can see the peak, but they still have a long and arduous climb ahead of them. The economy is recovering, but debt remains a major concern. The new government has a mandate for change, but they need to deliver on their promises. Human rights violations cast a long shadow, and justice remains elusive. The path ahead is uncertain. Sri Lanka could emerge from this crisis stronger and more resilient than ever before, or it could slip back into instability and conflict. The choices made today will determine the country's fate. It's time for Sri Lanka to rise to the challenge and create a brighter future for all its citizens.